Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 9, Section 4, The Turning Point. So let's begin. Number 1, Lincoln believed that capturing the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi was key to winning the war. Vicksburg, Mississippi is located along the Mississippi River, and it's about halfway between St. Louis and uh, New Orleans. And by having this as a Union stronghold, it would allow for the Union, for the most part, to control the entirety of the Mississippi River. At the time that this battle took place, St. Louis and the city of New Orleans were actually in the hands of the Unions, but it's this little stretch of river in between that was still in the hands of the Confederates. Vicksburg was well fortified, and to actually gain it took quite a bit of time in 1863. Number 2, Grant decided to move his troops across the Mississippi to the West Bank, right across from Vicksburg, by the way, Vicksburg being located on the East Bank. He marched his troops south and then came around from the east, kind of hoping that maybe the Confederates would be, number one, cut off from other supplies coming from the east, and the fact that they might be surprised to see the Union coming from that direction. This gamble paid off, and in time, eventually Vicksburg's going to fall into the hands of the Union. So in number 3, to distract the Confederates while Grant carried out his maneuver, Benjamin Garrison, who you see pictured below, led 1,700 troops on a cavalry raid through Mississippi. A lot of this was taking place to the east of Vicksburg. A lot of looting, a lot of disruption of movement of supplies. And for the most part, Vicksburg was cut off, allowing for eventually Grant and his troops to take the city. But it's going to come in time. Vicksburg was kind of a siege, and it took about 3 months. And what's interesting is the city of Vicksburg falls right around the 3rd of July, 1863. And what's remarkable about that, it's roughly the same day that the Battle of Gettysburg wraps up. So Abraham Lincoln is not only going to have one victory, but he's going to have 2 major victories on the same day in history. Number 4, Grant decided that the only way to take Vicksburg was to put the city under siege, cutting off its food and supplies and bombarding the city until the defenders gave up. And they did. Number 5, President Lincoln became frustrated with General McClellan back in 1862 because he let the Confederates slip away at the Battle of Antietam. For the most part, the very last regiment that could be called up for the Confederates had been called up that day at Antietam, and there was nothing left. And when the battle ended that day, these troops were able to slip back across the Potomac River. Had McClellan stopped and followed, we would have probably wrapped up the Civil War that day. Number 6, on May 2nd, 1863, Robert E. Lee's troops attacked General Hooker, who at this time replaced McClellan as the leader of the Army of the Potomac, at an area called the Wilderness. And on May 5th, Hooker decided to retreat. As a result of that, Hooker is going to be removed from his position as commander, and eventually he will be replaced. Number 7, at the end of 1863, some of Lee's troops headed into the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, hoping to seize a supply of shoes. Remember, our Confederate soldiers, they were not being well supplied, and by the time we get into about 1863, many of these troops are in rags, marching without shoes, and so any possibility of finding something like that was certainly a huge motivation, especially for Lee. The city of Gettysburg actually is kind of a crossroads. There are about 8 different roads that go into the city. And so, as far as travel there were many paths to get to Gettysburg. This is good and bad. For Lee, it allowed his troops to move very quickly, but at the same time, the Union troops were able to catch up with Lee in that community. And what we're going to have is a major showdown. So instead, our Confederate troops eventually find the Union cavalry. This all takes place on July the 1st, 1863. And what's going to happen over the course of 3 days of this battle is a variety of different events. You're going to have a day on July the 1st where it's kind of a stalemate. We have both Union and Confederate forces that are trying to get themselves established. Not much happens by sunset. On July the 2nd of 1863, you're going to have well-fortified sides. The Union is holding what is known as Cemetery Ridge, which is kind of the area where the cemetery had once been located in Gettysburg. And the Confederates hold land to the west known as Seminary Ridge, which is where a Lutheran seminary actually stands yet to this day. And in between is about a mile of basically farmland in between. And it's going to be in that area where we're going to have kind of the push-pull of different battles. That's going to happen starting on July the 2nd and kind of ending on July the 3rd. Number 8, at Gettysburg, the Union suffered 23,000 casualties. Casualties are not only just people wounded, but these are also the people who would die. But the South's toll had been estimated around 28,000 casualties. And part of that was because of an event known as Pickett Charge. Pickett's Charge took place on July the 3rd. It was kind of the last major part of the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's sometimes known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. There is a painting here in the slide that says Pickett's Charge, Battle of Gettysburg. And you see a Confederate, probably colonel or general, leading his troops. He has a saber in the air and his hat on the saber. That's so that his men could see where he was at. And it's supposedly at this moment that the Confederacy has reached its peak, because everything after this moment is going to be going right downhill, and we're going to have a series of great hurts for the Confederates. The thing about Pickett's Charge, this was something that General Lee ordered the morning of July the 3rd. And again, if you kind of move your eye back here towards this field, our Confederate troops, basically all of the troops that day, led by General Pickett's men, marched across this field roughly a mile from Seminary Ridge to Cemetery Ridge. And during that period of time, our Union forces were watching them come closer and fixing their aims and cannons at them. And literally, Pickett's men, who kind of led this group, were nearly wiped out. When the battle ends, there isn't much left of Pickett's unit. Pickett himself survives, but he is a crushed man. And this allows the Union to have a really decisive victory. So, number 9, the disaster at Gettysburg proved to be the turning point of the war. And everything after this is really going to be kind of in the hands of the Union, though it isn't going to go quick. We're going to still have, a couple more years here of fighting. Number 10, in Tennessee, both sides knew that if the Union forces captured the city of Chattanooga, which is kind of in the southeast corner of the state, they would control a major railroad running south to the city of Atlanta. And hence, that's where Grant and some of his men were going to focus their concentration. Although General Rosecrans forced the Confederates to evacuate Chattanooga, Union troops were attacked at a place called Chickamauga. And this is not very far from Chattanooga. It's kind of in the northern part of Georgia as they advanced into the state of Georgia. Even though they might have had a little loss here in Chickamauga, it isn't going to take long for their wounds to be healed and to keep marching again. And eventually, our troops are going to make it to the city of Atlanta. Number 12, President Abraham Lincoln sent General George Meade, who you see pictured down below here, to help at Chattanooga. With him were roughly 20,000 men. These men were with their artillery, their horses, and eventually their equipment. Most of these men were able to travel via rail lines, and for the most part, this allows guys like Grant to have, a superior advantage over the Confederate troops. Number 13, charging uphill through swirling fog, Union forces quickly drove the Southern troops off what is known as Lookout Mountain. Lookout Mountain is not very far from Atlanta, Georgia, and it's kind of a controversial site because of a sculpture that is actually on this mountain today. But needless to say, this was, again, another major victory for our Union forces. Number 14, General George Thomas's charge up Missionary Ridge scattered and surprised the Confederates during this battle. And as a result, the Union's going to win. And Abraham Lincoln is going to have a new man that he can turn to. Lincoln and number 15 rewarded Ulysses Grant by appointing him to be the general-in-chief of Union forces. And hence, he's promoted to lieutenant general, a rank that no one had held since General George Washington. Grant is put in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And it's going to be from this point on, basically the latter part of 1863, beginning of 1864, that Grant is going to be facing General Robert E. Lee on almost a daily basis. Thank you very much.